Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to close your eyes in a world where winter stretched for months, where your breath turned to mist inside your own home, and where the only barrier between you and the howling North Sea winds was timber, turf, and the flickering warmth of a single fire? Tonight, we're stepping back more than 1,000 years to the smoky interior of a Viking longhouse, where dozens of souls gathered each evening as darkness fell like a heavy blanket across the fjords. Picture yourself there, not as a heroic warrior from the sagas, but as one of the countless ordinary people who faced the simple, profound challenge of surviving another winter night. But before we step into this quiet journey through winter's hold on the early peoples of Scandinavia, I'd love a small favor. Tap the like button if your heart is ready to wander back in time with me tonight. Be sure to subscribe so you'll always be part of these late-night passages into history's forgotten corners. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Some of you may be awake in the stillness of night, others just beginning your morning, or somewhere in between. I treasure seeing how far our circle of time travelers reaches. Because trust me, what comes next is a story you won't want to miss. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum, and let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. Imagine yourself in the late months of winter, somewhere along the coast of what we now call Norway. In the year 847, the sun, when it appears at all, hangs low and pale for only a few precious hours. Most of your world exists in shades of grey and amber, the grey of endless twilight, the amber glow of the central hearth that never, ever goes out. You are not a chieftain. You are not a famous warrior whose name will echo through the sagas. You are one of the many. A fisher, perhaps, or someone who tends the small herds of goats and sheep. Your hands know the weight of nets heavy with salt water, the bite of iron tools against your palms, the endless, repetitive motions of survival. The longhouse where you sleep is a world unto itself. Picture a structure that might stretch 80 feet in length, perhaps 20 feet wide, large enough to hold 30 or 40 souls, sometimes more. The walls rise around you, constructed of thick timber planks chinked with clay and moss, while overhead layers of turf and bark create a roof so low that a tall man must stoop in places. The weight of earth above you feels almost comforting, like being gently pressed beneath a great living blanket. Step inside with me. The moment you push through the heavy wooden door, your senses are overwhelmed by the thick, complex atmosphere within. Wood smoke hangs in permanent suspension, rising from the long fire pit that runs down the center of the hall like a glowing spine. This smoke carries with it the scent of burning birch and oak, mixed with something earthier, the smell of damp wool, unwashed bodies, and the musk of animals who share your shelter. Strings of dried fish hang from the rafters like leather curtains, their salty aroma mingling with the sharper smell of fermented milk stored in wooden vessels. Somewhere in the shadows, you can hear the soft rustling of straw and the occasional snort or shuffle of a goat or sheep brought inside for the worst of the winter weather. The sleeping arrangements in your long house follow an unspoken hierarchy as rigid as any law. Along both walls, raised platforms stretch the length of the building, wooden planks covered with whatever bedding can be gathered. If you are fortunate, if your family has prospered in recent years, your section might be piled with thick woolen blankets, sheepskins with the fleece still attached, and perhaps even a precious down-filled bolster. More likely, though, your bed consists of a thin layer of straw or dried grass, a rough woolen cloak that serves as both blanket and pillow, and whatever additional coverings you can borrow, trade for, or simply hope others will share. The straw beneath you crackles and shifts with every movement, and you've long since grown accustomed to the tiny inhabitants that make their homes in such bedding, fleas and lice that treat human warmth as their own personal hearth. As darkness settles over the fjord outside, the Longhouse transforms. What was a workspace during the brief daylight hours where nets were mended, tools sharpened, and children taught the endless skills of survival now becomes a dormitory, a sanctuary, and sometimes a stage for the quiet dramas of community life. You remove your outer garments slowly, your fingers stiff from the day's work. Your boots, made of leather and stuffed with straw for insulation, come off reluctantly, releasing feet that are red with cold and often damp with the moisture that accumulates in any covering worn too long. The relief is immediate, but so is the vulnerability. Your feet, now exposed to the air, remind you just how precarious your warmth really is. Settling onto your section of the sleeping platform, you arrange yourself with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to find comfort in discomfort. Your woolen cloak goes beneath you first, a barrier between your body and the wooden planks that seem to draw heat away like a hungry ghost. Then you wrap yourself in whatever additional covering you possess, pulling it tight around your shoulders and tucking the edges beneath your body. But you are not alone in this nightly ritual. To your left, perhaps an elderly woman pulls her own threadbare blankets closer, muttering prayers to household spirits for warmth through the night. To your right, a young couple arranges their children between them, creating a small knot of shared body heat. Everyone understands the unspoken rule: warmth is communal, and survival often depends on the willingness to share what little heat your body can generate. As you close your eyes, the Longhouse settles into its nocturnal rhythm. The fire pit continues its eternal conversation, the whisper of flames consuming wood, the occasional pop and hiss as sap meets heat, the soft whoosh of air drawn up through the roof vents. These sounds become the heartbeat of your shelter, so constant that their absence would be more disturbing than their presence. Around you, the quiet symphony of communal life continues. Someone coughs, a sound that echoes off the timber walls and mingles with the softer sounds of shifting straw and whispered conversations. Children murmur in their sleep and occasionally cry out from dreams. Adults shift and turn, the wooden platforms creaking under their weight. Despite the central fire, despite the shared warmth of bodies pressed together, the cold is a living presence in the Longhouse. It creeps along the floor like an invisible tide, rises up through gaps in the wooden planking, and descends from the rafters where frost forms on the coldest nights. Your breath creates small clouds that dissipate in the smoky air, and by morning, any water left in containers near the walls might be frozen solid. You've learned to sleep in a particular way, curled tightly, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around your torso. Every part of your body that can be tucked away from the air is hidden beneath whatever covering you possess. Your feet, the most vulnerable to the cold, are wrapped in strips of wool or fur, and on the worst nights you might even share foot-warming duties with a sleeping partner, each of you taking turns keeping the other's feet pressed against your torso. Sleep, when it comes, is light and broken. The fire requires tending throughout the night. Someone must rise every few hours to add wood, to stir the embers back to proper flame. This duty rotates among the adults, and on your nights, you know the particular misery of leaving warm covers to tend the communal hearth. The wooden floor is shockingly cold against your feet, and the brief journey from your sleeping space to the fire pit and back again is enough to chill you thoroughly, requiring long minutes of shivering before warmth returns. Even when it's not your turn to tend the fire, sleep remains elusive. The smoke, while providing blessed warmth, also stings your eyes and makes your throat raw. You've developed the ability to sleep with your face partially covered, breathing through wool that filters the worst of the smoke while still allowing you to draw breath. In this communal sleeping arrangement, every sound, every movement, every bodily function becomes part of the shared experience. Arguments between couples are conducted in fierce whispers. Children's nightmares become everyone's concern. The snores of the elderly, the restless movements of those in pain, the quiet sobs of someone grieving a loss. All of these become the soundtrack of your nights. You've learned to create privacy through stillness, to find solitude in the midst of crowded quarters by simply lying very still and letting your mind wander. Sometimes you listen to the conversations around you, discussions of the next day's work, concerns about dwindling food stores, plans for when spring finally returns. Other times you let the sounds wash over you like water, becoming simply another element of the environment that surrounds your rest. When dawn finally comes, marked more by the gradual increase in activity than by any significant change in the light filtering through the small windows, the longhouse wakes slowly and collectively. The fire, carefully tended through the night, still glows in its pit, but the temperature has dropped significantly in the hours before dawn. Rising from your sleeping place is an act of will. The air strikes your face like a physical blow, and your body, stiff from hours of cramped positioning, protests every movement. Your first task is always the same: to move closer to the fire, to warm your hands enough that you can grip tools and weapons, to restore circulation to feet that have gone numb despite your best efforts to keep them warm. And so another day begins, much like the day before, much like the day that will follow. You will work until your hands crack and bleed. You will eat whatever food can be stretched to feed the community. You will mend what is broken, tend what needs tending, and prepare as best you can for another night in the longhouse. The cycle continues day after day, week after week, through the long winter months when the sun barely shows its face and the wind off the North Sea cuts through any gap in your shelter. This is survival in its most essential form. Not the dramatic battles of the sagas, but the quiet, persistent struggle to maintain warmth, to find rest, to wake each morning ready to face another day of simply staying alive. Living this way, pressed together with your community, dependent on the fire that never goes out, measuring your comfort in degrees of cold rather than degrees of warmth, creates a particular kind of resilience. You learn to be grateful for small things: a night when the wind doesn't howl through the walls, an evening when the fire burns bright and clean, a morning when you wake without coughing. You also learn the profound intimacy of shared hardship. The person beside you on the sleeping platform becomes more than a neighbor. They become a partner in the nightly struggle for warmth, a witness to your vulnerability, a source of comfort that goes beyond words. The children who curl against you for heat are not necessarily your own, but in the democracy of cold, they might as well be. As we drift deeper into this winter evening in the longhouse, feeling the weight of the turf roof above us and breathing the thick, smoky air, we begin to understand that sleep here was never truly private or individual. It was communal, like everything else in this harsh world at the edge of survival. The rhythm of shared breathing, the gentle sounds of shifting straw, the eternal whisper of the central fire, these become the lullaby that carries you toward whatever rest the night might offer. And tomorrow, if the gods are willing, you will wake to face another day, another night, another small victory in the endless struggle to stay warm, stay alive, and stay human in a world that offers no guarantees of any of these things. As the sun fades, let's shift our attention to one particular life, one woman whose story emerged from these very conditions we've just experienced. Her name was Gudrid Thorbjarnardottir, and she was born around the year 980 in Iceland, a land where longhouses dotted the landscape like wooden islands in an ocean of volcanic stone and winter wind. But Gudrid's story begins not with the famous voyages that would make her one of the most widely travelled women of her age, but with nights much like the one we've just lived through, curled beneath rough woolen covers in a smoky hall, listening to the wind test every joint and beam of her childhood home. The Iceland of Gudrid's birth was a frontier society, barely a century old, carved from volcanic wilderness by Norwegian settlers who had fled the consolidating power of Harald Fairhair. These were people who had chosen exile over submission, who had sailed into the unknown rather than bend the knee to kings. They brought with them the Longhouse traditions of their homeland, but adapted them to a landscape unlike anything in Norway, a place where the earth itself seemed alive with fire and ice, where glaciers ground against volcanic peaks and the aurora painted the winter sky in colors that had no names in any human tongue. Imagine yourself as a young girl in that world of shared warmth and whispered stories. Picture Gudrid as a child of perhaps 7 or 8 winters, small enough that she could curl completely beneath a single sheepskin, young enough that the adults still made space for her closest to the fire. Her earliest memories would have been tactile ones, the scratch of wool against her cheek, the way straw poked through thin fabric to tickle her legs, the particular scent that meant home, wood smoke and dried fish, and the warm animal smell of the household. The Longhouse, where Gudrid spent her childhood, was a structure born of necessity and refined by generations of bitter experience. Built of turf and stone with a wooden frame, it stretched perhaps 60 feet in length, its walls thick enough to hold back the fury of Arctic storms. The roof, covered in layers of sod that would sprout grass in summer, curved like the hull of an overturned ship, and perhaps that resemblance was intentional, for these were a seafaring people who understood that survival often meant thinking like sailors, even on dry land. Inside, the space was divided by function and status. The central hearth dominated the main hall, its stone-lined fire pit sending smoke up through a hole in the roof that could be partially covered during the worst weather. On either side of the hall, raised sleeping platforms ran the length of the building, divided by hanging curtains into family spaces. The most honored positions were closest to the fire, while servants and the least important family members slept near the doors where cold draughts crept in despite the builder's best efforts. In the longhouse of her father Thorbjarn, the evenings followed the same ancient rhythm we witnessed earlier. As darkness fell across the Icelandic landscape, a darkness that could last 18 hours during the deepest winter, the family and their household gathered around the central fire. Gudrid would have sat cross-legged on a folded cloak, her small hands busy with the endless work that occupied everyone during these long evening hours. The work itself was a meditation, a rhythm that connected her to countless generations of women who had performed these same motions. Her fingers, guided by her mother's patient instruction, learned to tease apart the tangled wool that came from the sheep, to align the fibers until they lay parallel like soldiers in formation. The wooden cards, their surfaces studded with bent wire teeth, became extensions of her hands, pulling and smoothing until the wool transformed from a matted, oily mess into something approaching silk. Then came the spinning, the ancient alchemy that turned fiber into thread. The spindle, carved from birch or ash and weighted with a clay whirl, became a dancing partner in her small hands. She learned to set it spinning with a flick of her fingers, to draw out the wool as it twisted, to feel in her fingertips the exact tension that would create thread strong enough for sailcloth or fine enough for the most delicate embroidery. The rhythm of her childhood was measured in wool and story. Her fingers learned their first lessons in the glow of that fire, how to card wool until it lay smooth and straight, how to spin thread on a simple wooden spindle, how to weave patterns that had been passed down from mother to daughter for generations beyond counting. But perhaps more important than these skills were the stories that accompanied the work, the sagas and family histories that turned the smoky air into a theatre of the imagination. The stories themselves were living things, changing slightly with each telling, adapting to the mood of the evening and the needs of the audience. Some were grand sagas of heroes and kings, of berserkers who fought bears with their bare hands and skalds who could compose verses that would outlive empires. Others were family histories, more intimate but no less important, tales of great-grandfathers who had claimed land by walking its boundaries in a single day, of ancestral mothers who had faced down trolls and outlaws with nothing but their wits and iron will. Gudrid's grandmother, a woman whose name has been lost to history, but whose influence shaped the girl who would one day sail to unknown shores, sat closest to the fire on the coldest nights. Her voice, weathered by years of smoke and winter air, would rise and fall with tales of distant lands, of ancestors who had sailed west from Norway, of the strange and wonderful things that lay beyond the horizon. This old woman had come to Iceland as a young bride, one of the pioneer generation who had carved the first farms from the wilderness. She remembered the early years when winter meant genuine uncertainty about survival, when a failed harvest or a harsh storm could mean the difference between life and death for an entire household. Her stories carried the weight of lived experience, the knowledge that came from having faced genuine hardship and emerged not just intact, but stronger. She spoke of the lands they had left behind, the green fjords of Norway, the ancient farms that had been passed down through bloodlines stretching back to the time of legends. But she also spoke of why they had left, of the growing power of kings who demanded submission from men who had always been their own masters, of the slow strangling of the old freedoms that had made life worth living. In the intimate democracy of the Longhouse, a child learned the true nature of the world. Here, stripped of the privacy that would separate family members in later centuries, every emotion and every conflict played out in the open. Gudrid learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when her father was worried about the approaching winter, when her mother was grieving for a child lost to disease, when the household servants were plotting some small rebellion against their lot in life. She learned, too, that authority was not absolute but negotiated, that even her father's word as master of the household could be challenged if it threatened the welfare of the family. She watched her mother exercise a different kind of power, quieter but no less real, managing the complex web of relationships that kept the household functioning through the darkest months. The politics of the Longhouse were the politics of survival, and they taught lessons that no amount of abstract instruction could convey. When food ran short, decisions about rationing had to be made not by royal decree, but by family consensus. When personalities clashed in the confined space, resolution had to come through negotiation and compromise, not through the intervention of distant authorities. But these evening hours also taught young Gudrid lessons that no saga could convey. She learned, for instance, that warmth was precious and must be shared, that her own comfort might depend on making room for a shivering cousin or an elderly servant. She learned that in the deep of winter, when food stores ran low, even the children were expected to eat less, so that the adults who did the heavy work might have strength for another day. The rationing was never cruel, but it was relentless in its logic. The men who cut wood and tended livestock needed more food than the women who spun and wove. The women who managed the household and bore children needed more than the elderly, who could contribute only their wisdom and their memories. The healthy needed more than the sick, the young more than the old. These calculations were made not with callousness, but with the cold clarity that comes from understanding that survival itself hung in the balance. Gudrid learned to accept her place in this hierarchy without resentment, but also without surrendering her own ambitions. She watched and listened, absorbing lessons about leadership and resource management that would serve her well when she found herself responsible for the welfare of others in circumstances far more challenging than even the harsh winters of Iceland. She learned, too, about the delicate negotiations that governed life in such close quarters. When arguments arose, and they did, for even the most harmonious household could be strained by months of confinement, resolution had to come through quiet words and careful compromise. There was no storming away in anger, no slamming of doors. Everything had to be worked out in whispers, settled with the kind of practical wisdom that puts survival above pride. The conflicts were often about seemingly trivial matters: who had taken more than their share of the good sleeping space, whose children were making too much noise during the evening meal, whether someone had been shirking their duties in the endless round of maintenance and preparation that kept the household functioning. But beneath these surface disagreements lay deeper tensions about status and power, about who belonged and who was merely tolerated, about what kind of future the family was building together. Gudrid learned to navigate these treacherous waters with the skill of a natural diplomat. She discovered that a soft word could often diffuse a situation that might otherwise explode into lasting enmity, that knowing when to speak and when to remain silent was as important as any other survival skill. She learned to build alliances across the lines of age and status, to find common ground with people who might seem to have nothing in common with a young girl from a farming family. The young woman who would cross oceans was forged in these smoky halls. The Longhouse was her first university, teaching lessons about human nature and group dynamics that would prove invaluable when she found herself leading expeditions into unknown territories. The patience required to endure months of confinement without losing her sanity, the ability to find small pleasures in the midst of hardship, the skill of managing limited resources while maintaining morale, all of these qualities were developed during those long winter nights of her childhood. But perhaps most importantly, the Longhouse taught her that home was not a place but a process, not a building but a way of being with other people. She learned that the warmth that mattered most was not the heat from the fire, but the human warmth that came from people choosing to care for each other, despite the difficulties and irritations of daily life. As Gudrid grew from child to young woman, the Longhouse began to feel different around her. What had once seemed vast and full of mystery now felt constraining, predictable. She knew every beam in the ceiling, every knot in the wooden walls. She could identify each member of the household by the sound of their breathing, could navigate from her sleeping place to the door in complete darkness. The familiarity that had once been comforting now felt like a limitation. She found herself restless during the long evening hours, her hands still busy with wool and thread, but her mind wandering beyond the smoke-stained walls to imagine what lay beyond the familiar horizons. The stories her grandmother told no longer seemed like entertainment, but like maps to a different kind of life, like invitations to adventures that might be waiting for someone bold enough to accept them. The work that had once seemed like play, the spinning and weaving, the endless preparation and preservation of food, became routine, necessary, but no longer engaging for a mind that had begun to wonder what lay beyond the familiar rhythm of days and seasons. When travelling merchants arrived with goods from Norway or the distant kingdoms to the south, Gudrid would linger near their conversations, hungry for news of the wider world. These merchants brought more than just goods. They brought stories of places where the rules might be different, where a young woman with skill and determination might carve out a different kind of life. They spoke of the growing settlements in Greenland, where Eric the Red was building something new, a society that combined the best of the old ways with the opportunities that came from having seemingly limitless land to explore and claim. They spoke, too, of stranger rumors, tales of lands even further west, places where the very trees and animals were unlike anything known in the civilized world. These stories might have seemed like mere fantasy to someone who had never lived beyond the familiar boundaries of her father's farm but to Gudrid they began to seem like possibilities, like challenges that might be worthy of the restless energy that was growing within her. The young woman who emerged from this childhood was in many ways typical of her time and place, skilled in the domestic arts that kept households functioning, trained in the social graces that maintained harmony in small communities, accustomed to hardship and uncertainty. But she was also something rarer, someone whose imagination had been nourished by stories of distant places, whose sense of possibility had been expanded beyond the conventional limits of what a woman might expect from life. When travelling merchants arrived with goods from Norway or the distant kingdoms to the south, Gudrid would linger near their conversations, hungry for news of the wider world. She learned to make herself useful to these visitors, offering them the best food, ensuring their comfort during their stay, while absorbing every word of their stories about the places they had seen and the opportunities that might await someone willing to take risks. These men, weathered by years of travel across dangerous seas, recognized something kindred in the young woman who listened so intently to their tales. They had seen many settlements across the North Atlantic, had observed many families struggling to build new lives in harsh circumstances, and they knew the qualities that made the difference between success and failure in such endeavors. In Gudrid they saw someone who possessed not just the practical skills that would be needed, but the mental flexibility and emotional resilience that were even more important. Marriage meant not escape, but a different kind of enclosure. When the time came for marriage, as it did for all young women in that world, often with little regard for their own preferences, Gudrid found herself bound first to a man named Thorir, a Norwegian who had come to Iceland seeking his fortune. The marriage took place during the brief brightness of summer, but by winter they were settled in their own section of a longhouse, not unlike the one where she had grown up. The marriage itself had been arranged with the kind of practical calculation that governed most such unions in that time and place. Thorir was not wealthy, but he was industrious and seemed likely to provide well for a family. He was not particularly handsome or charming, but he was steady and appeared to possess the kind of character that would weather the inevitable storms of married life. For Gudrid's father, it represented a reasonable alliance that would ensure his daughter's security without requiring too great a dowry or too many concessions about the terms of the union. For Gudrid herself, the marriage represented a complex mixture of hope and resignation. She had not been in love with Thorir, but neither had she felt any particular aversion to him. He seemed like the kind of man who would not interfere too much with her own pursuits and interests, who would allow her to maintain the friendships and activities that mattered to her. In a world where women had limited choices, this seemed like perhaps the best she could reasonably expect. But this new arrangement brought its own hardships. Now she was no longer the cherished daughter sleeping near the warm heart of the household, but a young wife expected to prove her worth through her work, and eventually through children. Her section of the sleeping platform was further from the fire, her voice carried less weight in the evening discussions, her comfort was secondary to that of the established families who dominated the Longhouse hierarchy. The adjustment was more difficult than she had anticipated. In her father's house, she had been valued for her potential, for the promise she showed as a young woman who might one day bring honor to the family name. In her husband's household, she was valued primarily for her immediate usefulness, for her ability to contribute to the daily work that kept the community functioning. The work itself was not particularly different from what she had done as an unmarried daughter, but the context had changed in ways that made everything more challenging. Now she was responsible not just for her own tasks, but for managing the complex relationships that would determine her family's status within the larger household. She had to navigate the expectations of her husband's relatives, earn the respect of the other wives, and establish her place in a hierarchy that she had not grown up understanding. The social dynamics were particularly complex. The other women in the household had their own alliances and rivalries, their own ideas about how things should be done and who should be responsible for what. Gudrid found herself caught between the desire to maintain her own standards and practices and the need to fit into established routines that might not make sense to her, but that had the weight of tradition behind them. More challenging still was the discovery that Thorir himself was not quite the man she had thought she was marrying. In the formal negotiations that had preceded their union, he had seemed steady and reliable, someone who could be counted on to fulfill his obligations and provide for his family. But in the intimate circumstances of marriage, she discovered that he was also somewhat lacking in imagination, content with the familiar routines of farming and household management in ways that made her own restlessness seem almost like a character flaw. The long night hours became a time for dreaming of elsewhere. It was during these years of early marriage, lying awake in the smoky darkness while Thorir slept beside her, that Gudrid first began to seriously contemplate the possibility of leaving Iceland entirely. The stories her grandmother had told, tales of Eric the Red's discovery of Greenland, rumors of lands even further west, no longer seemed like mere entertainment, but like maps to a different kind of life. The dreaming was not mere escapism, but a kind of mental preparation, a way of rehearsing for possibilities that might one day become real opportunities. She found herself imagining the practical details of such a journey. What supplies would be needed, how a household might be established in a place where there were no existing communities to provide support. What skills would be most valuable in circumstances that no one had ever faced before? These mental exercises were informed by her growing understanding of what it meant to build a life in harsh circumstances. Her years of marriage had taught her about the complexity of managing relationships and resources when survival itself was never guaranteed. She had learned to think strategically about problems that had no obvious solutions, to find ways of making progress toward long-term goals, even when immediate circumstances seemed to offer no room for maneuver. The more she contemplated the possibility of leaving Iceland, the more feasible it began to seem. She possessed skills that would be valuable anywhere: the ability to organize a household, to preserve food and manage resources, to maintain morale during difficult times. But more than that, she possessed something rarer: the mental flexibility to imagine different ways of living, different solutions to the eternal problems of human survival. She had heard that in Greenland the longhouses were built differently, adapted to an even harsher climate, but also to a landscape where a determined family could carve out their own domain. The idea of sleeping in a hall where she might be mistress rather than dependent, where the warmth of the fire might be hers to control, began to seem not just appealing, but necessary. The appeal was not simply about personal comfort or status, though those things mattered. It was about the possibility of building something new, of contributing to a community that was still being invented, rather than simply maintaining traditions that had been established by previous generations. In Greenland, she sensed, there might be room for someone like her to make a real difference, to use her skills and intelligence in ways that would matter, not just to her own family, but to the larger project of human expansion into unknown territories. Tragedy became the key that unlocked her destiny. When Thorir died, taken by the same kind of winter sickness that claimed so many in those crowded, smoky halls, Gudrid faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could remain in Iceland, accept another marriage arranged by male relatives, and settle into the familiar rhythm of Longhouse life. Or she could accept the proposal of Thorfinn Karlsefni, a prosperous merchant who spoke not just of marriage but of adventure, of joining the voyages west to Greenland and perhaps beyond. The death itself came with the sudden brutality that characterized so much of life in that harsh world. Thorir had been healthy enough at the beginning of winter, but by the time the storms set in, he was coughing up blood and struggling to breathe in the smoky air of the Longhouse. The sickness progressed quickly, leaving Gudrid with little time to prepare for the reality of widowhood. The practical consequences were immediate and stark. As a childless widow, she had no claim to Thorir's property and no guaranteed place in his family's household. Her own relatives were willing to take her back, but only on terms that would effectively reduce her to the status of a dependent daughter, someone whose future would be entirely subject to decisions made by fathers and brothers who might or might not have her best interests at heart. The conventional choice would have been to accept this situation, to remarry as quickly as possible to someone deemed suitable by her family, and to hope that the second marriage would prove more satisfactory than the first. Many women in her situation did exactly that, and found reasonable happiness within the constraints that such a choice imposed. But for Gudrid, the tragedy of Thorir's death had also created an opportunity that might not come again. Thorfinn Karlsefni was not just another Icelandic farmer looking for a wife to help manage his household. He was a merchant with ships and connections, someone who travelled regularly between Iceland and the growing settlements in Greenland, someone who was already planning to participate in the most ambitious voyage of exploration that had ever been attempted. The proposal he offered was unlike any she had ever heard of. He was not just looking for a wife who could spin wool and manage servants. He was looking for a partner who could help establish a completely new kind of settlement in a place where Europeans had never tried to live permanently. The risks were enormous, but so were the potential rewards, not just material wealth, but the chance to be part of something unprecedented in human history. The decision was made, perhaps, during those long winter nights when she lay alone on her section of the sleeping platform, listening to the familiar sounds of the Longhouse around her. The snoring of the elderly, the whispered conversations of young couples, the crying of children, all of it had become like a cage of sound, comfortable but confining. The warmth that had once meant survival now felt like a gentle prison. She realized that she had learned everything the Longhouse could teach her, had absorbed all the wisdom that this particular way of life could offer. To remain would mean spending the rest of her days repeating the same routines, facing the same challenges, living within the same narrow range of possibilities that had defined her mother's life and her grandmother's life before that. The prospect of leaving was terrifying, but the prospect of staying had become something worse than terrifying. It had become deadening. She could see too clearly how the rest of her life would unfold if she chose the safe path, could trace the predictable progression from young widow to settled matron to elderly storyteller, passing on to her own grandchildren the same tales of distant places that her own grandmother had told her. But now she had the chance to become the subject of such stories rather than merely their audience, to live adventures that future generations would tell around their own fires during the long winter nights. The decision, when it finally came, felt less like a choice than like a recognition of something that had always been inevitable. The skills learned by firelight became tools for crossing oceans. When Gudrid finally left Iceland in the spring of her 22nd year, she carried with her more than just the usual possessions of a young wife. She carried the knowledge that had been burned into her during all those winter evenings by the Longhouse fire, how to spin thread so fine it could be woven into sailcloth, how to preserve food for long journeys, how to sleep soundly in conditions that would defeat those accustomed to comfort. The practical skills were invaluable, but perhaps more important were the habits of mind that Longhouse life had developed in her. She knew how to think ahead, to anticipate problems before they became crises, to find solutions that took into account the needs and limitations of everyone involved. She knew how to maintain morale during difficult times, how to find reasons for hope when circumstances seemed hopeless, how to build consensus among people who might have very different ideas about what should be done. The voyage itself was a test of everything she had learned during her years in Iceland. The ship was essentially a floating longhouse, a confined space where the same dynamics of cooperation and conflict played out under even more challenging circumstances. But the skills that had served her well in the smoky halls of her childhood served her equally well on the deck of a ship crossing the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic. She discovered that the ability to find comfort in discomfort, to sleep soundly despite cold and noise and the constant motion of the sea, was as valuable on shipboard as it had been during the harsh winters of her youth. The knowledge of how to preserve food and manage limited supplies became crucial when the voyage took longer than expected and provisions began to run low. More than that, she carried the emotional resilience that came from years of negotiating the delicate social dynamics of communal living. She knew how to share space without surrendering identity, how to find privacy in the midst of crowds, how to endure discomfort without losing hope for something better. These skills, learned in the smoky intimacy of Icelandic longhouses, would serve her well in the strange new world of Greenland, and later in the even stranger lands that lay beyond the Western Sea. The ocean crossing was a revelation in itself, a demonstration of human capability that she had never imagined possible. To sit on the deck of a ship in the middle of the North Atlantic, surrounded by water in every direction, was to experience a kind of freedom that no longhouse could contain. The horizons expanded beyond anything she had ever seen. The sky opened up in ways that made even the vast landscapes of Iceland seem confined and limited. But the freedom came with its own terrors and challenges. Storms that would have been merely inconvenient on land became life-threatening disasters at sea. The same wind that could carry them swiftly toward their destination could also drive them off course or dash their ship against hidden rocks. The skills that made someone valuable on land, the ability to hunt or farm or build, became irrelevant in a world where survival depended entirely on the knowledge of how to handle sails and read weather patterns and navigate by the stars. In Greenland, the longhouses were built for different dreams. The settlement at Brattahlid, where Eric the Red had established his household, represented a new kind of longhouse culture. Here, the halls were built not just for survival, but for expansion, not just to endure the winter, but to plan for conquests and discoveries that would come with spring. The evening conversations around the fire included talk of ships and supplies, of routes across unknown waters, and the practical details of establishing settlements in lands where no European had ever spent a winter. The physical structures themselves were adapted to an even harsher climate than what she had known in Iceland. The walls were thicker, the sleeping platforms more carefully designed to conserve body heat, the storage areas more elaborate to accommodate the greater variety of supplies that were needed for survival in a place where trade goods were scarce and expensive. But the most important difference was not architectural, but cultural. This was a community that saw itself as being engaged in an ongoing project of expansion and exploration, rather than simply maintaining traditional ways of life. The conversations that took place around the fire during those long Greenland winters were unlike any that Gudrid had heard during her childhood in Iceland. Instead of focusing primarily on the management of familiar challenges, how to get through another winter, how to maintain the livestock, how to preserve the fragile social relationships that held the community together, these discussions ranged over questions that had never been asked before. How many people would be needed to establish a permanent settlement in an unknown land? What kinds of supplies would be essential, and what could be safely left behind? How should leadership be organized when there were no established precedents to follow? What kinds of relationships should be established with any indigenous peoples who might be encountered? These were not abstract questions, but practical problems that required immediate solutions. Gudrid, sitting in her new place around a new fire, found herself at the center of planning for the most ambitious voyage of her age, the expedition to Vinland, the mysterious country that Leif Erikson had discovered to the southwest. The skills she had learned in Icelandic longhouses were suddenly not just survival techniques, but qualifications for exploration. Her ability to organize a household, to preserve food and manage resources, to maintain harmony among people living in close quarters, all of this made her not just a suitable wife for an expedition leader, but an essential partner in the venture itself. The planning itself became a kind of education in the art of the impossible. Everything they were proposing to do violated the normal constraints that governed human settlement. They were talking about establishing a community in a place where they could not rely on trade or kinship networks, where they would have to be entirely self-sufficient in ways that no European community had ever been. They were planning to live among unfamiliar plants and animals, to adapt their farming and hunting techniques to species they had never encountered, to build shelters from materials they had never worked with before. But perhaps most challenging of all, they were planning to do all of this while maintaining the social and cultural structures that defined their identity as a people. It would have been one thing to simply survive in a new environment. It would be quite another to preserve the longhouse culture that had shaped them while adapting it to circumstances that none of their ancestors had ever faced. The rhythm of her days expanded to encompass unknown horizons. When the ships finally sailed west from Greenland, carrying Gudrid and Thorfinn and their companions toward the shores of North America, they carried with them the longhouse culture that had shaped them all. The temporary shelters they built in Vinland were essentially longhouses adapted to a new climate and new challenges, but following the same principles of shared warmth, communal labor, and collective survival that had governed life in Iceland and Greenland. The voyage itself was longer and more difficult than the crossing from Iceland to Greenland had been. They were sailing into waters that had been traversed by only a handful of Europeans, following directions that were more like rough sketches than detailed maps. The weather was unpredictable, the currents unfamiliar, the landmarks few and far between. But when they finally reached the shores of what would later be called North America, they found a land unlike anything they had imagined. The forests were vast beyond anything they had ever seen, filled with species of trees that had no names in any European language. The rivers teemed with fish, the meadows with game animals that seemed to show no fear of human hunters. The climate was milder than what they had known in Greenland or even Iceland, the growing season longer, the winters less brutal. Yet for all its apparent abundance, this new land presented challenges that none of their experience had prepared them to face. The indigenous peoples they encountered had their own complex cultures and territorial claims, their own ideas about how the land should be used and who should be allowed to settle where. The plants and animals that seemed so abundant were regulated by ecological relationships that the Europeans did not understand, and their attempts to hunt and farm according to familiar methods often produced unexpected results. But there was something different now in Gudrid's relationship to these spaces. She was no longer the young girl learning skills by the fire, no longer the dependent wife seeking her place in an established hierarchy. She was a leader, a decision-maker, someone whose voice carried weight in the discussions that would determine the fate of the entire expedition. The transformation had happened gradually, so gradually that she was not entirely conscious of it until she found herself in circumstances where it mattered. But the years of careful observation in Icelandic and Greenlandic longhouses, the accumulation of knowledge about how to manage resources and relationships under difficult conditions, the development of her own judgment about what worked and what didn't, all of this had combined to make her someone whose opinions were sought and valued by the other expedition leaders. Her relationship with Thorfinn was also different from what her marriage to Thorir had been. This was a partnership between equals, a collaboration between two people who had chosen each other not just for domestic compatibility, but for their shared vision of what might be accomplished in this new world. When decisions had to be made about where to establish their settlement, how to organize the work, how to respond to encounters with indigenous peoples, her voice carried as much weight as his. The longhouse they built in Vinland was both familiar and revolutionary. In structure, it followed the ancient pattern, the central hearth, the sleeping platforms along the walls, the careful organization of space according to function and status. But in purpose, it was something entirely new, designed not just to shelter a single extended family, but to serve as the nucleus of what might become a permanent European presence in the Americas. The evening conversations around that fire covered topics that would have been unimaginable to her grandmother in Iceland. They discussed not just the immediate challenges of survival, but the long-term questions of what kind of society they were trying to build. Should they attempt to establish trade relationships with the indigenous peoples, or would it be safer to maintain their independence? Should they focus on agriculture or on hunting and fishing? How could they maintain their cultural identity while adapting to circumstances that demanded constant innovation? The longhouse had taught her to dream beyond its walls. The child who had curled beneath sheepskins in her father's hall, listening to her grandmother's stories of distant lands, had become the adult who would give birth to the first European child born in the Americas. The young woman who had learned to find comfort in discomfort, to sleep soundly despite smoke and cold, and the press of other bodies, had become the explorer who could establish a household on the shores of an unknown continent. The birth of her son Snorri in Vinland was a moment that crystallized everything she had learned about the relationship between home and exploration, between tradition and innovation. Here she was, thousands of miles from the longhouse where she had been born, bringing a new life into a world that no European child had ever known, yet following patterns of childbirth and childcare that stretched back through countless generations of her ancestors. The longhouse where Snorri was born was heated by the same kind of central fire that had warmed her own childhood, filled with the same kinds of sounds, the murmur of conversation, the crackling of burning wood, the soft whisper of wind through the roof. But it was also something unprecedented, a European structure on American soil, a fusion of old-world techniques with new-world materials. The experience of motherhood in this strange new place taught her lessons about adaptability that she could never have learned in Iceland or even Greenland. She had to modify traditional practices to accommodate unfamiliar circumstances, finding substitutes for medicinal plants that didn't grow in Vinland, adapting clothing patterns to work with different kinds of animal skins, learning to recognize the signs of weather patterns that followed unfamiliar rules. But perhaps most remarkably, she had become someone who could return, who could sail back across the dark Atlantic, settle again in Iceland, and find contentment in the familiar rhythm of longhouse life. The voyages to Greenland and Vinland had not cured her of the need for community and shared warmth. They had simply expanded her understanding of where such community might be found. The decision to leave Vinland was not made lightly or easily. The settlement had been successful in many ways. They had survived their first winter, established productive relationships with some of the indigenous peoples, proven that Europeans could live permanently in this new land. But they had also discovered that the challenges were greater and more complex than they had anticipated. The conflicts with indigenous groups, while not constant, were serious enough to raise questions about the long-term viability of a small European settlement. The isolation from their homeland meant that any serious crisis, a major injury, a failed harvest, a breakdown in leadership, could become catastrophic in ways that would not be true in Iceland or Greenland, where help from neighboring communities was at least theoretically possible. Perhaps most importantly, they had come to understand that successful colonization would require not just a few dozen hardy individuals, but a much larger commitment of people and resources than their small expedition could provide. The dream of establishing a permanent European presence in Vinland was not impossible, but it would have to wait for a time when the Norse communities of Iceland and Greenland were wealthy and populous enough to support such an ambitious undertaking. The journey back across the Atlantic was both a retreat and a homecoming. Gudrid carried with her not just her young son and the material goods they had accumulated during their stay in Vinland, but a transformed understanding of what home meant and what it might become. She had seen possibilities that her grandmother could never have imagined, had lived experiences that would enrich the stories told around Icelandic fires for generations to come. The skills that had carried her to the shores of America, the ability to adapt familiar techniques to unfamiliar circumstances, the capacity to maintain hope and purpose in the face of uncertainty, the knowledge of how to build community among people who had to depend entirely on each other, these same skills would serve her well as she re-established herself in the more familiar but still challenging world of the North Atlantic settlements. In the end, all roads led back to the fire. The last records of Gudrid show her in her final years, living quietly in Iceland, her travelling days behind her. But the stories suggest that she had become something new, a woman who carried within herself the memory of many homes, many fires, many different ways of sleeping safely through the long winter nights. The return to Iceland was not a defeat, but a completion, a closing of a circle that had begun in her childhood when she first heard stories of distant lands. She had become the living embodiment of those stories, someone who could speak from direct experience about the possibilities that lay beyond the familiar horizons. When she sat by the fire in her later years, telling her own grandchildren about the forests of Vinland and the challenges of establishing a home in an unknown world, she was not just entertaining them, but preparing them, opening their minds to possibilities they might one day choose to pursue. The Longhouse, where she spent her final years, was both exactly like and completely different from the one where she had grown up. The physical structure was familiar, the same turf walls, the same central hearth, the same sleeping platforms arranged according to ancient custom. But the conversations that took place around that fire now included topics that would have been incomprehensible to her childhood self. She spoke of navigating by stars that were invisible from Iceland, of building shelters from trees that grew nowhere in the North Atlantic, of negotiating with peoples whose languages had no connection to any European tongue. But more than the exotic details, she spoke of the fundamental human experiences that had connected her adventures to the ancient patterns of Longhouse life, the need for warmth and companionship, the importance of shared work and mutual support, the eternal challenge of creating meaning and purpose in the face of an indifferent universe. The young people who listened to her stories heard in them echoes of the same themes that had shaped the traditional sagas, but with a new depth and complexity that came from lived experience. They learned that courage was not just the ability to face physical danger, but the capacity to imagine different ways of living and then to act on those imaginings. They learned that adventure was not just about traveling to distant places, but about the internal journey of discovering what they were capable of becoming. Her influence on the next generation was profound but subtle. She did not advocate that everyone should follow her path. Indeed, she understood better than anyone how exceptional her circumstances had been, how many factors had combined to make her voyages possible. But she did communicate, through her stories and her example, that the familiar constraints of Longhouse life were not the absolute limits of human possibility. The children who grew up listening to Gudrid's stories carried within themselves a different sense of what the future might hold. They were still prepared for the traditional challenges of North Atlantic life, the harsh winters, the difficult farming conditions, the complex social negotiations that governed small communities. But they were also prepared for possibilities that their parents' generation could never have imagined. Some of them would indeed follow in her footsteps, becoming part of later expeditions to Greenland and beyond. Others would find ways to apply the lessons of her adventures to the challenges of life in Iceland itself, becoming leaders and innovators who helped their communities adapt to changing circumstances. But all of them carried within themselves something of the mental flexibility and emotional resilience that had made Gudrid's achievements possible. The Longhouse culture that had shaped her childhood had given her not just the skills for survival, but the emotional architecture for a life of extraordinary scope and adventure. She had learned, in those smoky halls of her youth, that home was not a place but a set of relationships, not a building but a way of being with others. These lessons had allowed her to find home in Greenland, in Vinland, and finally back in Iceland, carrying within her the accumulated warmth of many fires, many stories, many nights spent listening to the wind test the strength of human shelter. The relationships that had sustained her through her adventures were not fundamentally different from those that had sustained her ancestors through countless harsh winters in Iceland and Norway before that. The same basic human needs for companionship, for purpose, for a sense of belonging to something larger than oneself had driven her voyages and had ultimately brought her home again. But her understanding of how those needs might be met had been expanded beyond anything her ancestors could have imagined. She had learned that community could be created among strangers thrown together by circumstance, that home could be established in places where no human being had ever lived before, that the fundamental patterns of human cooperation could be adapted to challenges that had no precedent in recorded history. The rhythm of her days, expanded beyond anything her grandmother could have imagined, still followed the ancient pattern of fire and story, work and rest, survival, and the dreams that make survival worthwhile. In her final years, sitting by the familiar warmth of an Icelandic hearth, she embodied the eternal cycle of human experience, the journey outward into unknown territories, and the return inward to the essential truths that make such journeys meaningful. Her legacy was not just in the geographical discoveries she had helped to make, though those were significant enough. It was not just in the practical knowledge she had accumulated about navigation and settlement, though that knowledge would prove valuable to future generations of explorers. Her most important legacy was the demonstration that the human capacity for adaptation and growth was far greater than anyone had previously understood. The Longhouse had been humanity's solution to the challenge of surviving in harsh climates with limited resources. But Gudrid had shown that it could also be a launching pad for expeditions into territories that no human being had ever seen, a training ground for adventures that would test every aspect of human capability. The same cultural patterns that had allowed her ancestors to survive the winters of Scandinavia had also given her the tools she needed to establish a home on the shores of North America. In the end, her story was both extraordinary and typical, extraordinary in its scope and achievements, typical in its fundamental humanity. She had faced the same basic challenges that confronted every woman of her time: how to find security and purpose within the constraints imposed by circumstances beyond her control, how to maintain her identity while adapting to changing situations, how to contribute to the welfare of her community while pursuing her own dreams and ambitions. The difference was that she had found ways to expand those constraints, to transform limitations into opportunities, to use the skills and knowledge that her culture had given her as tools for creating entirely new possibilities. She had shown that the ancient patterns of human cooperation were not just mechanisms for survival, but foundations for exploration, not just ways of enduring difficult circumstances, but platforms for launching adventures that would reshape the world. The fire around which she spent her final years was both an ending and a beginning, the culmination of a life of extraordinary achievement and the source of inspiration for future generations who would carry the light of human curiosity and courage into territories yet to be discovered. The smoke that rose from her hearth carried with it the essence of all the fires that had warmed her journey, all the stories that had shaped her understanding, all the dreams that had made her one of the most remarkable figures in the long history of human exploration. The Longhouse that had taught her to dream beyond its walls had ultimately expanded to encompass the entire North Atlantic world, and through her influence would continue to expand as long as there were horizons left to explore and stories left to tell around the eternal fires of human community. Let us now drift from daily struggle into mystery, into the gaps between what we know and what we can only imagine about how these people truly rested. There is something profoundly intimate about sleep, so personal, so universal, yet so rarely recorded in the chronicles of the past. The Vikings who carved runes and composed elaborate sagas somehow failed to leave us detailed accounts of their nightly rituals, their methods for staying warm, their dreams and nightmares. What remains is a puzzle assembled from fragments, archaeological traces, brief mentions in literature, and the educated guesses of scholars who have spent lifetimes trying to peer into the smoky darkness of these ancient halls. Sleep, after all, occupies a third of every human life, yet it exists in the shadows of historical consciousness. While we can trace the evolution of Viking ship construction through careful analysis of preserved vessels, while we can reconstruct their religious beliefs from carved stones and ritual deposits, the nightly experience of rest remains as elusive as morning mist. It is as if an entire dimension of human experience has been erased from the record, leaving us to wonder not just how they slept, but how they understood sleep itself. Consider this curious fact: in all the thousands of lines of Icelandic sagas, with their detailed descriptions of feasts and battles, of journeys and political intrigue, there are perhaps a dozen casual references to sleeping arrangements. The literature that preserves every detail of sword-making and shipbuilding treats sleep as something too mundane, too obvious to require explanation. Yet for us, separated by a millennium from these lives, this silence creates a mystery as compelling as any buried treasure. When Njal's saga describes the burning of Njal's house, it mentions that the family was in their beds when the attack began, but tells us nothing about what those beds were like, how they were arranged, what protected the sleepers from the cold. When the Laxdæla saga describes the wealthy household of Olaf the Peacock, it lovingly details his imported tapestries and silver-mounted weapons, but the sleeping arrangements that would have occupied half of every 24-hour period are dismissed with phrases like, "they settled down for the night." This literary silence extends beyond mere oversight. The saga writers were intimately familiar with every aspect of the lives they described. They knew the weight of a sword in hand, the feel of salt spray on ocean voyages, the complex social dynamics that governed their society. Their failure to describe sleeping arrangements suggests something deeper, that these practices were so deeply embedded in daily experience, so thoroughly understood by their audience, that explanation seemed unnecessary. Yet this very universality, which made description seem superfluous to medieval writers, transforms into profound mystery for modern readers. We are left to imagine not just the physical aspects of Viking sleep, but the cultural assumptions that surrounded it, the social rules that governed it, the spiritual beliefs that shaped it. The silence becomes a void that draws us in, demanding that we exercise both scholarly rigor and imaginative empathy to begin to understand. The saga writers' casual references become precious clues. When they mention someone taking to their bed or rising from sleep, they assume a whole world of shared understanding that we must now painstakingly reconstruct. Their throwaway phrases about nighttime activities, the brief mention of someone stirring the fire in the dark hours, the casual reference to night talk between sleepers, become windows into a lost world of domestic intimacy. The most revealing glimpses into Viking sleeping practices come not from written sources but from the patient work of archaeologists who have excavated the remains of longhouses across Scandinavia. At Borg, in the Lofoten Islands of northern Norway, excavations have revealed a longhouse that once stretched over 270 feet in length, a structure so vast that it challenges our assumptions about how such spaces might have been heated and inhabited. The central hearth at Borg was enormous, capable of burning logs that would have required several men to carry. Around it, the archaeologists found evidence of raised platforms along the walls, but the organic materials that would have served as bedding, the straw, wool, and furs that made sleep possible, have long since decomposed, leaving only stains in the soil and occasional fragments of textile preserved by rare combinations of moisture and chemistry. The scale of these structures forces us to reimagine the very nature of Viking domestic life. A longhouse like the one at Borg was not simply a home in the modern sense, but a complex social institution that housed multiple families, their dependents, their guests, and their animals under a single roof. The logistics of organizing sleep in such a space would have required sophisticated social protocols that have left no direct trace in the historical record. Archaeological evidence from other sites adds layers to the mystery. At Tissø in Denmark, excavations have revealed longhouses with specialized sleeping areas that seem to have been designed for different social classes or family groups. Some platforms are raised higher than others, some are positioned closer to the central hearth, some show evidence of more elaborate construction techniques. But the social rules that determined who slept where and why remain hidden. The preservation of organic materials offers occasional tantalizing glimpses. At Mammen in Denmark, a 10th century burial contained textiles so well preserved that we can see the intricate weaving patterns the dyes used, even the wear patterns that suggest how the fabrics were used. But these are burial textiles, chosen for their symbolic importance rather than their practical utility. What people actually slept under during their living years remains largely unknown. At Firkat in Denmark, archaeologists have found traces of what appear to be private sleeping alcoves within larger longhouse structures, areas partitioned by wooden screens or hanging textiles. But here again, the evidence is tantalizing rather than complete. We can see the post holes where screens might have been erected, the slight depressions where beds might have been built, but we cannot hear the conversations that took place behind those screens, cannot feel the weight of the blankets that covered those who slept there. These ghost impressions tell stories that we can only half read. The wear patterns on stone thresholds suggest the movement of people through domestic spaces, but we cannot know whether they moved quietly to avoid disturbing sleepers, or whether the sounds of nighttime activity were simply accepted as part of communal living. The stains in the soil where bedding once rested hint at the organic materials that provided comfort, but we cannot know how these materials felt against the skin, how they smelled after months of use, how they were maintained and replaced. At some sites, archaeologists have found evidence of sophisticated drainage systems designed to keep sleeping areas dry, suggesting that Viking builders understood the relationship between moisture and comfort in ways that required considerable technical knowledge. But the daily maintenance of these systems, the social responsibilities for their upkeep, the consequences when they failed, all of this remains hidden in the archaeological silence. The positioning of these sleeping areas within the larger structures reveals patterns that suggest complex social hierarchies. Some are clustered near the high seat, others are relegated to the darker ends of the hall. Some show evidence of permanent construction, others seem to have been temporary or seasonal. But the social dynamics that created these patterns, the negotiations and conflicts that determined sleeping arrangements, exist now only as shadows cast by the physical evidence. Even more mysterious are the findings at Longhouse Meadows, the Viking settlement on the coast of Newfoundland. Here, archaeologists have uncovered longhouse remains that show clear evidence of adaptation to an even harsher climate than the settlers would have known in Greenland or Iceland. The central hearths are larger, the wall construction heavier, and there are traces of what may have been double-walled construction designed to create insulating air spaces. But again, the organic materials that would tell us how people actually slept, how they stayed warm through the long winter nights of a new continent, have vanished into the soil. The Longhouse Meadows site forces us to consider the adaptability of Viking sleeping practices. These were people who had already adapted to the harsh climates of Iceland and Greenland, yet they found it necessary to modify their construction techniques further when they reached North America. What does this tell us about the relationship between architecture and comfort in their understanding? How quickly could they adapt their sleeping practices to new environments? The site also raises questions about the psychological dimensions of sleep in an utterly foreign environment. These settlers were sleeping in structures on a continent where no European had ever slept before, surrounded by unfamiliar sounds, unknown weather patterns, and the constant awareness that they were farther from home than any of their people had ever been. How did this psychological isolation affect their rest? Did they dream differently in the new world? Archaeological analysis of the hearth remains at Longhouse Meadows suggests that the settlers burned different types of fuel than they would have used in Scandinavia, adapting to the available resources of their new environment. But this adaptation would have changed not just the heat output of their fires, but the smoke, the smell, the very atmosphere of their sleeping spaces. The sensory environment of sleep was transformed by geography and necessity in ways we can barely imagine. The brevity of the settlement, archaeological evidence suggests it was occupied for only a few years, adds another layer of mystery. Were the sleeping arrangements at Longhouse Meadows always understood to be temporary? Did this temporariness affect how people organized their rest, their comfort, their sense of home? Or did the settlers adapt so fully to their new environment that leaving represented a genuine loss of a developed way of life? One of the most persistent mysteries surrounding Viking longhouses concerns ventilation and air quality during the winter months. The archaeological evidence shows us central hearths that burned continuously, but the physics of smoke dispersal in low-ceilinged halls presents problems that no ancient source bothers to address. How did people breathe comfortably in spaces where fires burned all night? How did they prevent carbon monoxide poisoning? How did they manage the balance between warmth and air quality? Modern experiments with reconstructed longhouses have revealed the complexity of this challenge. Without adequate ventilation, the air quality becomes dangerous within hours. With too much ventilation, the heat is lost, and the space becomes uninhabitable in winter conditions. The Vikings must have developed sophisticated techniques for managing this balance, but the specific methods remain largely mysterious. Some scholars have suggested that longhouse inhabitants slept in shifts, with some people tending the fire while others rested. This would explain how the central hearth could burn safely all night, but it raises new questions about social organization and sleep schedules. Who would have been responsible for fire tending? How would these responsibilities have been distributed across age groups and social classes? Did fire tenders sleep during the day, creating a household that never fully slept at any single time? Others have proposed that the smoke itself was considered beneficial, that the Vikings understood its insecticidal properties and accepted the discomfort as a reasonable trade-off for freedom from fleas and lice. This theory gains support from ethnographic evidence of similar practices in other traditional societies, but it also raises questions about the long-term health effects of sleeping in smoky environments. Did Viking communities suffer from respiratory ailments that we would associate with chronic smoke exposure? Did they develop cultural practices that mitigated these effects? The positioning of sleeping areas in relation to the central hearth suggests a sophisticated understanding of air circulation patterns. Archaeological evidence shows that some sleeping platforms were positioned to take advantage of rising warm air, while others seem designed to avoid the direct path of smoke. But the knowledge system that informed these design decisions, the accumulated wisdom about air movement, heat distribution, and smoke management, exists now only in the patterns left by ancient builders. The question of winter ventilation becomes even more complex when we consider the presence of animals within the longhouse. Many Viking halls housed livestock during the winter months, adding another layer to the puzzle of air quality and smoke management. How did the presence of animals affect the atmospheric conditions? Did their body heat contribute to the overall heating system? Did their respiration create additional challenges for air quality? Perhaps the most frustrating gap in our knowledge concerns the actual materials used for bedding in Viking-age longhouses. We know from scattered references that wealthy households possessed imported textiles, fine woolens, and exotic furs. But what did ordinary families sleep under during the long winter months? How were these materials cleaned and maintained in an era when washing meant hauling water from frozen streams and heating it over precious fires? The archaeological evidence provides tantalizing hints. Fragments of textile found in graves and rubbish pits suggest the types of materials that were available, but grave goods were chosen for their symbolic rather than practical value. And rubbish pit contents represent discarded rather than actively used items. The bedding that people actually slept under, the materials that provided comfort and warmth through months of winter darkness, remains largely invisible in the archaeological record. Experimental archaeologists have attempted to recreate Viking bedding using materials that would have been available to medieval Scandinavians. Their experiments suggest that a combination of loose straw for insulation, wool textiles for warmth, and animal hides for weather protection could create surprisingly comfortable sleeping arrangements. But these experiments are conducted by modern people who return to heated homes at the end of each day, not by families facing months of reliance on such primitive arrangements. The maintenance of bedding materials presents practical challenges that the historical sources never address. How often was straw bedding replaced? How were woolen textiles cleaned without modern soaps and washing techniques? How were animal hides processed and maintained to remain supple and comfortable over long periods of use? The daily labor involved in maintaining comfortable sleeping arrangements must have been considerable, but the social organization of this labor remains hidden. The question of bedding materials also raises issues of social hierarchy and resource distribution. Did wealthy families hoard the finest furs and textiles for themselves, or were there social obligations to share comfort materials during the harshest periods of winter? How were decisions made about the allocation of limited bedding resources within large household communities? The social dynamics of comfort and survival must have been complex and sometimes contentious, but they have left no direct trace in the historical record. Seasonal variation in bedding materials adds another layer of mystery. The thick furs and heavy textiles necessary for winter survival would have been unbearable during the brief but intense heat of northern summers. But how were these transitions managed? Were there separate sets of bedding for different seasons? How were heavy winter materials stored during the summer months to prevent deterioration from insects and moisture? The longhouses excavated by archaeologists vary enormously in size and internal organization, suggesting that sleeping arrangements were far from standardized. Some halls appear to have been designed for large communal gatherings, with sleeping spaces arranged democratically along both walls. Others show evidence of clear hierarchies, with raised platforms at one end and more modest arrangements toward the other. But how were these spaces actually used during the winter months? Did entire extended families sleep in the same hall, or were there mechanisms for creating privacy that have left no archaeological trace? How did young couples manage intimacy in spaces where every whisper could be heard by dozens of others? How were conflicts resolved when people had no choice but to spend months in close proximity? The question of privacy becomes particularly acute when we consider the full range of human activities that must have taken place in these shared sleeping spaces: birth, death, illness, marital intimacy. All of these intensely private experiences would have occurred under the eyes and ears of the larger household community. What social protocols governed these moments? How were boundaries established and maintained in spaces that offered little physical privacy? Archaeological evidence suggests that some longhouses were equipped with internal partitions or screens that could provide temporary privacy, but the traces of these features are often ambiguous. Were these partitions permanent features of the architecture, or were they temporary arrangements created as needed? Who had the authority to erect such barriers, and under what circumstances? The social rules governing privacy in communal sleeping spaces must have been complex and carefully observed, but they exist now only as implications drawn from fragmentary physical evidence. The acoustic properties of longhouse spaces add another dimension to the privacy puzzle. Wooden construction and low ceilings would have created acoustic conditions very different from modern buildings. How did people manage conversations that were meant to be private? Did they develop techniques for minimizing sound transmission, or did they simply accept that privacy was primarily a social rather than physical phenomenon? The positioning of sleeping areas relative to household activity zones suggests that privacy was achieved through social conventions rather than physical barriers. Some sleeping areas were located in zones that would have been relatively protected from the main traffic patterns of daily life, while others were positioned in ways that would have offered little escape from the constant movement and activity of the household community. Particularly mysterious is the question of how children fit into longhouse sleeping arrangements. The sagas occasionally mention children, but almost never in the context of daily life and domestic arrangements. Archaeological evidence tells us that Viking-age families were often large, but the physical remains of longhouses seem inadequately sized for the numbers of people who must have inhabited them. Some scholars have suggested that children slept with their parents until relatively late ages, sharing body heat and blanket space as a matter of survival rather than choice. Others propose that children may have slept in shifts, with older children taking responsibility for younger ones, while adults worked or stood watch. But again, these are educated guesses rather than documented facts. The question of child safety in communal sleeping arrangements raises additional mysteries. How were young children protected from the dangers of central hearths and burning embers? How were they prevented from wandering outside during the night in dangerous winter conditions? The responsibility for child supervision during the vulnerable hours of sleep must have been carefully organized, but the specific systems and protocols remain hidden. The developmental psychology of children sleeping in communal arrangements presents questions that extend beyond practical concerns. How did young Vikings learn to sleep in noisy, crowded conditions? At what age were they expected to manage their own sleep schedules and arrangements? How did the communal sleeping experience shape their understanding of privacy, intimacy, and individual space? The archaeological evidence occasionally provides hints about children's sleeping arrangements. At some sites, archaeologists have found sleeping platforms that seem too small for adults, suggesting dedicated spaces for children. But were these permanent arrangements, or were they reconfigured as children grew and family circumstances changed? The flexibility of sleeping arrangements to accommodate changing household compositions remains largely mysterious. The question of children's bedding materials raises additional practical concerns. Were children provided with the same quality of bedding as adults, or were there different standards based on age and social status? How were decisions made about resource allocation when bedding materials were limited? The social dynamics of protecting and providing for children within resource-constrained household communities must have been complex and sometimes difficult. Even if we could perfectly reconstruct the sleeping arrangements of a single Viking household, we would still face the question of how these arrangements changed with the seasons. The longhouse that provided adequate shelter during the bitter cold of winter might have been stifling during the brief but intense heat of a northern summer. Did families reorganize their sleeping spaces seasonally? Did they move outdoors during the warmest months? Did they adjust their bedding materials and arrangements according to weather patterns? The archaeological evidence suggests that some longhouses were used year-round while others show signs of seasonal occupation, but the reasons for these patterns remain unclear. Were they related to economic activities like fishing or farming, or did they reflect preferences about sleeping arrangements that we can no longer understand? The brief northern summer presented challenges very different from winter survival. How did families adapt their sleeping arrangements when the midnight sun made traditional day-night cycles irrelevant? Did they maintain winter sleeping schedules during summer months, or did they reorganize their entire approach to rest and activity? The psychological and social adjustments required for seasonal transitions must have been considerable, but they have left no direct trace in the historical record. The question of outdoor sleeping during summer months raises additional mysteries. Did Viking families have techniques for sleeping outdoors that have been forgotten? Were there portable shelter systems that allowed for comfortable outdoor rest during traveling seasons? The saga literature mentions outdoor sleeping during journeys and military campaigns, but it provides few details about the practical arrangements that made such sleeping possible. The transition periods between seasons, the long twilight of autumn, the gradual return of light in spring, would have created their own challenges for sleep and rest. How did people adapt their sleeping patterns to gradually changing light conditions? Did they develop cultural practices that helped manage the psychological effects of extreme seasonal variation? The relationship between natural cycles and human rest patterns in northern climates remains largely unexplored in the historical sources. Seasonal variation in available materials would have affected bedding choices and sleeping comfort throughout the year. The fresh straw and clean textiles available during summer harvest periods would have been very different from the worn and musty bedding materials available at the end of long winter months. How were these resource cycles managed to maintain comfort throughout the year? Perhaps the most poetic mystery surrounding Viking sleep concerns their dream life and their beliefs about the night hours. Scattered references in the literature suggest that the Vikings believed the boundary between the world of the living and the world of spirits was thinner during sleep, that dreams could carry messages from the gods or warnings about the future. But what were the actual dreams of people who slept in smoky halls, surrounded by the sounds of animals and other humans, with the constant awareness that winter survival depended on the maintenance of a single fire? Did they dream of warmth and summer? Did they have nightmares about the fire going out? Did the smoke that filled their lungs affect the content and quality of their dreams? The limited references to dreams in saga literature suggest that Vikings took dream content seriously, interpreting nighttime visions as communications from supernatural sources. But how did the physical conditions of longhouse sleeping affect this spiritual dimension of rest? Did the communal nature of sleeping arrangements influence the content of dreams? Were there social protocols for sharing and interpreting dream experiences within the household community? The sensory environment of longhouse sleeping, the smell of smoke, the sounds of other sleepers, the feel of rough textiles and straw bedding, must have created a dream landscape very different from modern sleeping environments. Did these sensory conditions produce characteristic types of dreams or nightmares? Were there cultural interpretations of dreams that took into account the specific conditions of communal sleeping? The psychological effects of sleeping in close proximity to fire present additional questions about dream content and sleep quality. The flickering light of burning embers, the occasional sparks and flares of the central hearth, the constant awareness of fire as both protector and potential destroyer, all of these factors must have influenced the unconscious mind during sleep hours. The spiritual beliefs surrounding sleep and dreams may have extended to the physical arrangements of bedding and sleeping spaces. Were there ritual practices associated with preparing for sleep? Did the positioning of bodies and bedding follow patterns that were designed to facilitate communication with spiritual forces? The intersection of practical and spiritual concerns in sleeping arrangements remains largely hidden in the historical record. There is something almost comical about trying to reconstruct the acoustics of sleep in a Viking longhouse. 40 or 50 people sleeping in a single hall would have created a symphony of snoring, shifting, coughing, and whispered conversations. How did anyone achieve restful sleep under such conditions? Did they develop techniques for blocking out noise that we have forgotten? Did the constant background sound become so familiar that it actually aided sleep rather than hindering it? The thick walls of longhouse construction would have provided some acoustic insulation from outside noise, but they would also have trapped and amplified the sounds generated by the inhabitants. Every cough would have echoed off the walls, every shift in sleeping position would have creaked through the wooden platforms. The acoustic environment of communal sleep would have been unlike anything most modern people have experienced. Modern sleep research suggests that consistent background noise can actually improve sleep quality by masking irregular sounds that might otherwise cause awakening. Did Viking communities unconsciously develop this principle, accepting and even cultivating a consistent acoustic environment that promoted rest? Were there social conventions about noise levels and sound management during sleeping hours? The question of snoring presents particular challenges in a communal sleeping environment. How were chronic snorers accommodated within the social arrangements of the longhouse? Were there techniques for minimizing snoring that have been forgotten? Did sleeping positions and bedding arrangements take acoustic considerations into account? The sounds of animals within the longhouse would have added another layer to the nighttime acoustic environment. The breathing and movement of livestock, the occasional cry of a disturbed animal, the scratching and scurrying of smaller creatures, all of these sounds would have been part of the normal background of sleep. How did people learn to distinguish between normal animal sounds and those that might signal danger or distress? The acoustics of different seasons would have created varying soundscapes for sleep. Winter storms howling around the longhouse walls, the crack and pop of burning logs, the settling sounds of heavily loaded roof timbers under snow. All of these seasonal variations would have affected the auditory environment of rest. Did people develop seasonal adaptations to these changing acoustic conditions? Viking beliefs included the concept of household spirits, landvettir, and other supernatural beings who were thought to protect the home and family. Some scholars have suggested that these beliefs extended to sleeping arrangements, that certain areas of the longhouse were considered sacred or protected, that sleeping positions and bedding arrangements followed ritual patterns that ensured spiritual protection through the dangerous hours of darkness. But again, the evidence is fragmentary. We have occasional references to protective charms placed under pillows or sleeping areas, mentions of rituals performed before sleep, hints that the arrangement of bedding and the orientation of sleeping bodies followed patterns that were religious as well as practical. But the details of these practices, if they existed, have been lost to time. The concept of spiritual protection during sleep raises questions about the intersection of practical and supernatural concerns in longhouse arrangements. Were certain sleeping positions considered more spiritually secure than others? Did the placement of bedding relative to the central hearth have ritual as well as practical significance? The spiritual dimensions of sleeping arrangements may have been as important as physical comfort, but they remain largely invisible in the historical record. Archaeological evidence occasionally hints at ritual practices associated with sleeping areas. At some sites, archaeologists have found small objects, beads, pendants, carved pieces, in locations that seem to correspond to sleeping areas. Were these items placed intentionally as protective charms, or are they simply the random debris of daily life? The interpretation of such evidence requires careful consideration of both practical and spiritual possibilities. The household spirits that protected the Longhouse community were thought to be particularly active during the night hours, when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds was considered most permeable. How did this belief system affect the practical organization of sleep? Were there areas of the Longhouse that were avoided during sleep hours because of spiritual concerns? Were there rituals or offerings that ensured the protection of sleeping household members? The question of spiritual protection extends to the broader landscape surrounding the Longhouse. The Landvettir were thought to inhabit the local terrain, and their goodwill was considered essential for the prosperity and safety of the household. Did the orientation of sleeping areas within the Longhouse take into account the spiritual geography of the surrounding landscape? Were there seasonal variations in spiritual protection that affected sleeping arrangements? As we drift deeper into this mystery, surrounded by questions that may never be fully answered, we begin to sense the Longhouse not just as a shelter, but as a kind of theatre where the most private aspects of human experience, sleep, dreams, vulnerability, became part of a collective performance that lasted from sunset to sunrise, from the first snowfall to the spring thaw. In this theatre, every night was both an individual journey into unconsciousness and a communal act of survival. The mystery lies not just in the practical details, what they slept on, how they stayed warm, but in the psychological and spiritual dimensions of sleep that took place in such circumstances. How did privacy and community intersect during the most vulnerable hours of each day? How did individual dreams and collective survival create a nightly drama that we can only imagine? The theatrical metaphor becomes more compelling when we consider the performed aspects of communal sleeping. The process of settling down for the night, the rituals of banking fires and securing the hall, the quiet conversations that bridged the transition from waking to sleeping, all of these activities would have been scripted by cultural convention and social expectation. Yet within these collective performances, each individual would have carried out their own private preparations for sleep, their own personal rituals and concerns. The Longhouse at night was a space where social hierarchies were simultaneously reinforced and suspended. The physical arrangements of sleeping areas reflected and maintained social distinctions, yet the common vulnerability of sleep created a temporary equality among all the household members. The wealthy chieftain and the humblest servant were equally dependent on the maintenance of the central fire, equally vulnerable to the dangers of winter weather and structural failure. The nightly transformation of the Longhouse from a space of work and social activity into a space of rest and dreams represents one of the most profound mysteries of Viking domestic life. How was this transformation managed? What signals indicated that the transition from day to night activities should begin? How were the various practical tasks of preparing for sleep coordinated among so many people sharing the same space? The dreams and nightmares that filled the Longhouse during the dark hours created a collective unconscious landscape that we can barely imagine. With dozens of people experiencing sleep and dreams in close proximity, with the sounds and movements of dreamers affecting the sleep of others. The boundary between individual and collective unconscious experience may have been more fluid than we can understand from our perspective of private, individual sleep. Perhaps the most beautiful aspect of this mystery is that it forces us to rely on our imagination as much as our scholarship. In the absence of detailed written accounts, in the gaps between archaeological findings, we must picture for ourselves what it felt like to close our eyes in those smoky halls, to trust our survival to the maintenance of a communal fire, to find rest in the midst of a dozen different kinds of discomfort. The Vikings who lived these experiences found them so ordinary, so unremarkable, that they saw no need to record them for posterity, but their silence creates for us a space of wonder, an invitation to imagine our way into lives that were simultaneously more communal and more precarious than anything most of us have experienced. This silence becomes a form of historical poetry, creating spaces where imagination and scholarship must work together to reconstruct human experience. The gaps in our knowledge are not simply obstacles to understanding, but opportunities for empathetic connection across the centuries. In trying to imagine how Vikings slept, we are forced to confront our own assumptions about privacy, comfort, and individual space. The poetic dimension of historical silence extends beyond the mere absence of information. It becomes an active force that shapes our understanding, drawing us into a more intimate relationship with the past than complete documentation might allow. We are compelled to use not just our analytical skills, but our capacity for empathy and imagination, creating a more holistic engagement with historical experience. The mystery of Viking sleep becomes a meditation on the nature of historical knowledge itself, what we can know with certainty, what we can reasonably infer, and what we must imagine. These categories blend and overlap in ways that challenge traditional approaches to historical scholarship. The silence of the sources becomes not just an obstacle but a teacher, showing us the limits and possibilities of historical understanding. As the embers of archaeological evidence glow dimly in the darkness of historical knowledge, as the scattered fragments of literary reference provide only the faintest illumination of actual experience, we are left with something more valuable than complete documentation. We are left with the recognition that human beings have always found ways to sleep, to rest, to dream, even under the most challenging circumstances. The mystery of Viking sleep becomes ultimately a meditation on resilience, on the infinite human capacity for adaptation and survival. In longhouses across medieval Scandinavia, people found ways to be comfortable in conditions that would challenge our modern understanding of comfort. They found privacy in the midst of crowds, warmth in the depths of winter, rest despite smoke and noise and the constant presence of others. The adaptability demonstrated by Viking sleeping practices speaks to fundamental human capacities that transcend specific historical periods. The ability to find rest under difficult conditions, to create systems of mutual care and protection, to maintain community solidarity through the vulnerable hours of darkness. These capabilities remain relevant to our understanding of human resilience and social cooperation. The mystery also teaches us about the relationship between individual and collective well-being in traditional societies. The survival of each person depended on the successful functioning of the entire household community, yet each individual brought their own needs, preferences, and limitations to the collective arrangements. The balance between personal comfort and group survival that was negotiated nightly in Viking longhouses offers lessons about social cooperation that extend far beyond historical curiosity. The rhythm of their nights, lost to history but preserved in our imagination, reminds us that sleep itself is one of the most profound mysteries of human existence. In every age, in every culture, human beings have had to find ways to surrender conscious control, to trust in the protection of their community, to enter the vulnerable state of sleep despite uncertainty about the future. The Viking achievement was not just in creating shelters that provided physical protection, but in developing social and cultural systems that made collective vulnerability bearable and even comfortable. They created communities in which trust was sufficiently strong that dozens of people could sleep peacefully in close proximity, in which social protocols were sufficiently well developed that privacy and intimacy could coexist with communal living, in which spiritual beliefs provided comfort and meaning to the daily cycle of waking and sleeping. As we contemplate the mystery of their nights, we are drawn into a deeper appreciation of the complexity and sophistication of Viking society. These were not primitive people struggling for mere survival, but members of a complex civilization that had developed solutions to fundamental human challenges that continue to face us today. Their silence about their sleeping practices becomes not a sign of simplicity, but evidence of mastery. They had solved these problems so effectively that explanation seemed unnecessary. The longhouse at night, filled with the sounds of sleeping people, warmed by carefully tended fires, protected by social bonds and spiritual beliefs, represents an achievement in human cooperation and adaptation that deserves our admiration and study. In the darkness of these ancient halls, in the mystery of their lost sleeping practices, we find not just historical curiosity but enduring lessons about the capacity of human communities to create comfort, safety, and meaning even under the most challenging circumstances. The mystery remains, and perhaps it should. In the gaps between what we can know and what we can only imagine, we find space for wonder, for empathy, and for a deeper appreciation of the complexity and beauty of human experience across time. The Vikings sleep on in our imagination, wrapped in furs we cannot identify, dreaming dreams we cannot share, but reminding us through their silence of the eternal human need for rest, for warmth, for the protection that comes from sleeping safely among those we trust. Elsewhere, at the privileged end of the same halls, another kind of life unfolds in the winter darkness. In the smoky democracy of survival that we have been exploring, there existed islands of privilege, spaces within the longhouse where proximity to the fire was not left to chance, where the quality of bedding was a mark of status, where even sleep became a performance of power. The chieftains and their families who occupied these favored positions were still subject to the same winter cold, still breathed the same smoky air, but their experience of the long dark months was transformed by degrees of comfort that separated them as surely as walls, though often no walls existed. The architecture of hierarchy began with distance from discomfort. Picture the far end of the longhouse we have been inhabiting, but now let your eyes adjust to see it through the lens of medieval social structure. Here, raised slightly above the rest of the hall, often on a wooden dais that lifts them both literally and symbolically above their dependents, the household's elite arrange themselves for sleep with a ceremony that reflects their status in the world beyond these walls. The chieftain's sleeping area is defined not by privacy, for true privacy was still a luxury that even wealth could not easily purchase, but by the quality and quantity of comfort that wealth could accumulate. Where the common folk make do with straw and rough wool. Here we find carefully woven tapestries hanging from the rafters, creating the illusion of separate chambers within the larger space. These hangings serve practical purposes. They help contain heat and reduce drafts, but they also serve as displays of affluence, often decorated with scenes from mythology or genealogical symbols that remind viewers of the family's prestigious lineage. The bedding of the elite tells stories of distant lands and ancient victories. The sleeping arrangements of a successful chieftain might include furs from animals that ordinary farmers never see. Arctic fox with its thick winter coat, seal skins that repel moisture, even the occasional polar bear hide that represents not just wealth, but connections to hunters who venture into the most dangerous northern waters. These furs are layered over wooden bed frames that are themselves works of craftsmanship, carved with intricate patterns and sometimes inlaid with metal or amber. But perhaps most luxurious of all are the textiles, woolen blankets woven so finely that they feel soft rather than scratchy against the skin, linen imported from distant kingdoms where flax grows in abundance, silk ribbons and trim that speak of trade connections reaching as far as Constantinople. These materials are not just comfortable, they are statements of power, visible reminders of the chieftain's ability to command resources from across the known world. The woman who bears the keys controls more than storage chests. In this elevated section of the longhouse, the chieftain's wife occupies a position that gives her unique authority over the domestic arrangements that make elite comfort possible. She wears at her belt the keys to the household's locked storage chests, keys that represent her control over the family's most precious possessions, including the bedding and textiles that distinguish their sleeping arrangements from those of their dependents. This woman, let us call her Thora, for it was a common name among the wives of prominent men, has spent her daylight hours managing a complex household economy that extends far beyond the walls of the Longhouse. She has overseen the work of servant women who spin thread, weave cloth, and maintain the elaborate textiles that warm her family's sleep. She has negotiated with traveling merchants for imported luxuries, bartered surplus grain for exotic furs, managed the careful storage and preservation of wealth that can be converted into comfort during the long winter months. Even privilege must bow to the tyranny of the central fire. But for all their elevated status, for all of the comfort that wealth can purchase, the elite inhabitants of the Longhouse remain subject to the same fundamental constraints that govern everyone else in the hall. The fire that provides heat cannot be moved. It burns where it burns, and even the chieftain's family must arrange their sleep around its immutable presence. Their elevated platform brings them closer to the rafters where smoke gathers thickest, and their tapestries, while providing some protection from drafts, also trap the smoke that seeps through every gap in the Longhouse structure. On the coldest nights, even Thora finds herself making calculations that would be familiar to the humblest servant, whether to sleep closer to the fire and risk breathing heavier smoke, or further away where the air is clearer but the cold more penetrating. Her fine woolen blankets provide better insulation than rough homespun, but they cannot overcome the basic physics of heat distribution in a medieval hall. The rituals of elite sleep reveal the performance of power. What truly distinguishes the sleep of the wealthy is not just material comfort, but the elaborate social rituals that surround their nightly rest. While common folk simply lie down when exhaustion overcomes them, the chieftain's retirement becomes a kind of ceremony that reinforces his authority even as he prepares for his most vulnerable hours. Servants assist with the removal of his day clothes and the arrangement of his sleeping garments, not out of necessity, for he is perfectly capable of undressing himself, but as a display of the leisure that wealth affords. His weapons are placed within arm's reach, but they are arranged on stands that are themselves works of art, carved and decorated to demonstrate that even his tools of war are expressions of aesthetic sensibility. The privilege of warmth extends to the rituals of family life. The elite section of the Longhouse becomes, during the evening hours, a stage for the performance of family relationships that are themselves expressions of status. The chieftain's children gather around their parents not just for warmth, but for instruction in the genealogies and legends that define their place in the world. These evening recitations serve multiple purposes. They educate the young, they entertain the household, and they reinforce the family's claims to authority and respect. But even these privileged children must learn to sleep in conditions that would challenge modern sensibilities. Their beds are softer, their blankets finer, their proximity to the fire more assured, but they still fall asleep to the sounds of dozens of other people settling for the night, still wake to air thick with smoke and the breath of many sleepers. The loneliness of leadership in the communal darkness. There is a particular kind of isolation that comes with privilege in such close quarters. The chieftain, surrounded by dependents who cannot forget his authority even during the most intimate hours of rest, must sleep with the awareness that every sound he makes, every restless movement, every private conversation with his wife is being observed and interpreted by others whose own survival depends on maintaining his favor. This surveillance works both ways. Just as the common folk are always aware of their leader's moods and preferences, so the leader must remain constantly alert to the subtle dynamics of the household that surrounds his sleep. A servant's cough might signal illness that could spread through the close quarters. A whispered argument between dependents might indicate tensions that could threaten household harmony. Even in sleep, leadership requires a kind of vigilance that ordinary folk are spared. The burden of hospitality transforms private rest into public performance. Viking culture placed enormous emphasis on hospitality, on the obligation of the wealthy to provide food, and shelter for travellers, allies, and dependents. This meant that the chieftain's longhouse was rarely occupied only by his immediate family and regular servants. Throughout the winter months, the hall might host a rotating cast of visitors, other chieftains and their retinues, merchants waiting for spring sailing weather, poets, and craftsmen seeking patronage. These guests must be accommodated according to their status, and their sleeping arrangements become part of the complex social calculus that governs life in the longhouse. A visiting chieftain cannot be placed near the cold outer walls without giving offence, but neither can he be granted a position closer to the fire than his rank warrants. These negotiations of space and comfort become diplomatic exercises that the household's leader must navigate even as he seeks his own rest. The fragility of comfort in an uncertain world, perhaps most poignantly, the privileges of elite sleep in the longhouse were always provisional, always subject to the reversals of fortune that could transform a chieftain into an exile overnight. The fine furs and imported textiles that marked high status could be lost in a single, disastrous trading voyage. The loyal dependents who ensured warmth and comfort could be killed in raids or seduced away by more successful rivals. The awareness of this fragility coloured even the most comfortable nights in the longhouse. The chieftain who fell asleep wrapped in silk and polar bear fur did so with the knowledge that his enemies were plotting in other halls, that his own dependents might betray him if circumstances changed, that the same winter storms that threatened the humblest farmer also threatened the trading networks that sustained his wealth. The democracy of dreams levels all hierarchies, but ultimately, in the deepest hours of the night, when the fire burned low and the longhouse settled into its quietest rhythms, even the most elaborate privileges of wealth could not overcome the fundamental equality of human sleep. The chieftain's dreams were as vulnerable to interruption by a crying child as anyone else's. His rest was as dependent on the maintenance of the central fire as that of his humblest dependent. His breath turned to mist in the cold air just as readily as that of the servants who slept at the far end of the hall. In those dark hours, the elaborate hierarchy of day dissolved into something more elemental, the shared vulnerability of human beings seeking rest in a harsh world. The expensive furs provided better insulation, the carved bed frame offered superior support, the tapestried alcove created an illusion of privacy, but none of these privileges could grant the gift that everyone in the hall sought, deep, restorative sleep that would prepare them for another day of navigating the complex social and economic networks that sustained their world. The morning light reveals the performance beginning anew. With dawn, such as it was during the dark months of winter, the hierarchy would reassemble itself with the same careful attention to status and privilege that had governed the previous evening's arrangements. The chieftain would rise first, assisted by servants who had maintained the fire through the night. His fine clothes would be arranged, his weapons presented, his position at the head of the hall re-established through 100 small rituals that confirmed his authority. But for those few hours of deep sleep in the democracy of darkness, all the inhabitants of the longhouse had shared something more fundamental than social position, the ancient human need for rest, for dreams, for the mysterious restoration that comes when consciousness surrenders to the rhythm of breath and heartbeat. The contrast illuminates the universal struggle for warmth and rest. As we consider the gulf between the sleeping arrangements of chieftains and commoners, we are reminded that even privilege, in that harsh world, was measured in degrees of discomfort rather than absolute comfort. The elite slept better than their dependents, but they still slept in smoky halls, still woke with throats raw from breathing the night air, still faced the daily challenge of staying warm in a world where warmth was precious and precarious. Their advantages were real but limited: softer bedding that still required careful maintenance, better heating arrangements that still depended on the same fires, more privacy that was still fundamentally public. In the end, the Longhouse imposed its own egalitarian constraints on everyone who sought shelter within its walls. The gentle close of another winter day in the hierarchy of warmth. And so we leave our chieftains and their families settling into their privileged corners of the Longhouse, surrounded by the symbols of their status, but subject to the same fundamental challenges that governed all human sleep in that distant world. Their furs are finer, their beds more elaborate, their position more secure. But the wind that tests the Longhouse walls makes no distinction between rich and poor, and the fire that must burn all night serves the survival of all who gather around its warmth. The rhythm of their nights, elevated above but still part of the communal struggle for rest and warmth, reminds us that luxury itself was once defined not by isolation from hardship, but by marginally superior methods of enduring what everyone had to endure. In this, perhaps, there is something both humbling and oddly comforting, the recognition that human beings have always found ways to create hierarchy and meaning even in the most challenging circumstances, and that even the most privileged among us share the fundamental vulnerabilities that define our common humanity. As our journey through these smoky halls draws to its gentle close, let us step back across the centuries to where we began. The fire that burned through those long winter nights in Viking longhouses has been cold for 1,000 years. The voices that whispered in the darkness, the children who cried out from dreams, the elders who muttered prayers to household spirits, all have been silent for generations beyond counting. The straw that rustled beneath restless sleepers has crumbled to dust. The woolen blankets have returned to earth. The carved beams that supported those turf roofs have long since fallen and decayed. But something remains, something more durable than timber and stone, more persistent than even the archaeological traces that scholars study with such care. What remains is the unbroken thread of human need that connects us across all those centuries, the same fundamental requirement for warmth, for rest, for the daily miracle of waking refreshed to face another day. In the comfort of our modern nights, we carry the dreams of all who came before. Tonight, as you prepare for sleep, you will perform rituals that would have been unimaginable luxury to Gudrid Thorbjarnardottir, or the chieftains who slept on carved platforms near the Longhouse fires. You will adjust a thermostat rather than tend a fire. You will close a door rather than arrange a hanging tapestry. You will sleep alone or with only those you choose to share your bed, in a silence broken only by the distant hum of machinery rather than the breathing of dozens of others. Your pillow will be soft and clean, your blankets warm without weight, your mattress engineered for comfort in ways that medieval minds could never have conceived. The air you breathe will be filtered and heated, free of the smoke that stung the eyes of every person who ever slept in a Viking longhouse. Your sleep will be private, protected, as far from the communal vulnerability of those ancient halls as human ingenuity has been able to achieve. Yet the need that drives us to our beds remains unchanged. Despite all our modern comfort, despite the technological marvels that separate us from that world of smoky halls and shared straw, we seek the same restoration that they sought. We close our eyes with the same trust that they displayed. The faith that consciousness can be safely surrendered, that we will wake to face another day, that the darkness holds renewal rather than danger. We dream as they dreamed, though our dreams are filled with different fears and hopes. We shift and turn in our sleep, seeking comfort, as they did on their platforms of wood and straw. We wake, as they woke, to the gentle return of awareness and the daily choice to rise and meet whatever challenges await. The Longhouse teaches us lessons about the nature of home. Perhaps most profoundly, our journey through these ancient halls reminds us that home has always been less about physical comfort than about the presence of others who share our vulnerabilities. The Vikings who slept in longhouses knew a kind of security that had nothing to do with locks or walls or private bedrooms, the security that comes from sleeping within reach of others who share your fate, who will tend the fire when you cannot, who will wake if danger threatens the community. In our modern world of private bedrooms and individual comfort, we have gained much but perhaps lost something as well. That sense of being part of a larger organism of survival, of belonging to a group whose prosperity and safety are inseparably linked to our own. The Longhouse, for all its discomforts, was a place where no one slept alone, where the rhythm of community life continued even through the hours of rest. The smoke clears to reveal the universal human story. As the last embers of our imaginative fire fade to ash, as the smoky air of the Longhouse clears to reveal the clean comfort of your own sleeping space, what lingers is not the hardship but the resilience, not the discomfort, but the ingenuity with which human beings have always found ways to rest and dream and wake renewed. The Vikings who slept in those halls were not so different from us. They loved their children, worried about the future, took comfort in familiar rituals, and found ways to laugh even in the darkest months of winter. They told stories to pass the time, shared what little they had with those in need, and created beauty even in the most utilitarian aspects of their lives. In their dreams, we find our own. The dreams that visited them in those smoky halls, dreams of spring's return, of successful voyages, of children grown safe and strong, are not so different from the dreams that visit us in our climate-controlled bedrooms. We dream of security, of love, of meaningful work, of communities where we belong and contribute. We dream of warmth, though ours is more often emotional than physical. We dream of adventures, though ours may take us to different shores than those that called to Gudrid Thorbjarnardottir. The rhythm of sleep connects all generations, and so as you prepare for your own night's rest, remember that you are participating in a ritual as old as humanity itself, the daily surrender to sleep that has sustained our species through ice ages and plagues, through migrations across continents and voyages across unknown seas. The Vikings who slept in longhouses were links in the same chain that includes you, participants in the same ancient cycle of rest and renewal that makes all human civilization possible. Let the gentle darkness carry you home. Close your eyes then with gratitude for the comfort that surrounds you, but also with recognition of your connection to all who have sought rest before you. Let the whisper of your climate control system echo the whisper of wind through longhouse walls. Let the softness of your pillow remind you of the countless generations who found comfort in far simpler arrangements. Let your dreams carry forward the hopes and fears and loves of all who have dreamed before you. Sleep well, traveller through time. Sleep warm, descendant of those who learned to survive the coldest nights. Sleep peacefully, heir to all the accumulated wisdom of those who tended fires through the darkest hours and woke to greet another dawn. The fire may be cold, but the warmth continues. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off to the same slow march through history. Until we meet again in another time, another place, another quiet corner of the human story, rest well and dream of all the homes that have sheltered human sleep across the endless generations of our shared journey through time. The rhythm of their days and hours continues in the gentle darkness. Thank you for wandering through another quiet corner of history with me tonight. If this slow story brought you a little peace, feel free to subscribe. I share fresh, gentle stories almost each day. There's another calm tale waiting on the screen, or you can simply tap below to join our circle of nighttime historians. Sleep well until the next story.